Hey guys, how are you all doing? This lecture will be for Wednesday, May 13th. Today is Tuesday. I think most of you guys are wrapping up your New Deal World War II test. Um, so there are We've got about 6 days left before the Ascension Thursday break, and then we have Thursday, Friday, and Monday for Memorial Day off. We're somewhere, I think, around the 19 or 20-day mark until the end of school. Now, normally, what I would do at this time of the year is Cold War and the units that are coming. They're smaller, mostly because they're more recent, and also because the regents in the final do not emphasize them as much as they do the earlier part of the year. So typically during Cold War, I would test that in a review test, and then anything that we covered forward from there would also be covered in a larger review test. We don't really need to do that, so I will make unit specific tests for these units as long as I can get enough questions for them, which could be a little tricky, but maybe we'll combine uh, this unit with the 1960s, or we'll do a Cold War in total test and then more of a domestic test. So let me work on that and then I'll get back to you. So this unit is just going to cover the Cold War from 1945 to 53, which is basically the end of World War II to the end of the Korean War. Now, the Cold War is really going to go on from the end of the war, end of World War II, which is 1945, all the way till about 1989, 1990, when you have the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union. So the Cold War will be a backdrop for and animosity with and towards the Soviets will be a backdrop for us for the rest of the year until we get to 1990. I think the first thing that we need to point out is the reason why it is called a Cold War. The reason why it is called a Cold War is because the Americans and the Soviets never actually fire guns at each other. They never actually square off to fight one another directly, as in most wars that we've ever talked about. So it's cold in the sense of there isn't direct fighting between the two main adversaries. They are going to fight with each other through other countries and other endeavors, and we'll talk about that as we move forward. But really, it's the last two standing. The US and the Soviets, they are two of the four Allied powers. Britain and France are the other two. But remember, Britain was attacked by the air, or through the air by the Germans. They are weary of fighting back-to-back world wars. It basically went World War One, Depression, World War Two. So they are looking at a 30-year time period of not really doing great as a country. And France is even much worse because the Germans took France not once but twice in World War One and World War Two, or at least parts of France. Remember, Hitler marched into Paris like there was nobody there. So France is decimated. They're both war torn. They're both, remember, World War into Depression, back into World War. So, yes, there are four Allied powers, but there really are only two superpowers, if you will, when we come out of the war. And that is going to be the United States and the Soviets. So, I'm born in 1982, and I can remember the tail end of the Cold War. I mean, I think Rocky IV came out in 1988. So I was 6 years old. I remember watching that movie. I mean, so some of my, if your memory goes back to when you're 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, I do remember the end of the tensions, and I also remember the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviets as very happy days for America. But I'm on the tail end of the fear. And fear is the number one word when it comes to Soviet Union and communism during the Cold War. Fear kept us at war while we really were never fighting with guns, men, weapons, the other side of this war. So it's an ideological struggle with some military engagements through other countries, kind of like proxy wars, if you will. So, like, we fought against Soviet communism, or at least this is what we justified it as, during Korea, during Vietnam. Even though you were fighting Koreans or Vietnamese, you, in ideology, were fighting against Soviet communism. Okay? So, if there is one word that you want to remember when it comes to international policy during this sort of 40-year, 45-year window, the word is going to be fear. Okay? So, two powers left, us and the Soviets. We are going to be more powerful than them. And we were more powerful throughout the entire Cold War. And it's easy to say that now because we've now had, 30 years since the end of it for historians and economists to go back through and really kind of pick through it with a fine tooth and comb. But we were emerging as the number one power in the world going into World War II. And after World War II, it is clear that it is us and us alone. If there is going to be a second place, it's going to be the Soviet Union. We are the biggest in production, right? It was the gross national product war, and we were able to win this war because we could outproduce everybody else. So we have an enormous leg up on the Soviets at the beginning of this thing. We alone possess the atomic bomb. Not only do we alone possess it, but we have alone been showing have shown now the willingness to use it if we need to. So, it isn't just a fear of communism. It's a fear of America out there in the world as well, because if we bombed one country, why wouldn't we use it again? Maybe it would be easier the second time. Once you use something that is that dangerous and that murderous, now the bar's been set higher. The lines are different. The lines of demarcation are now different in the world. So there's a legacy of that throughout this, 4.5 decade time period of who has nukes, who's willing to use them, who's got the best scientists, who can produce them in quantity if needed, and then again, who's selling them and pushing them around the world to their allies. So FDR is going to set a precedent that the U.S. not go back to isolationism. We did it after World War I. It had largely been the DNA of our foreign policy from the very beginning, from George Washington. Europe was crazy. We were new. We were about making money and freedom. They were about old world and aristocracies and nobilities and all the tribal and ethnic differences, and we wanted to avoid it. But the proof is there. The world is now too small. We're trading with everybody. Everyone's interconnected. And if that's going to be the way the world is going to operate, then we are going to have to lead from the front. So we are no longer going to take an isolationist trend. We are going to be heavily involved. The UN, the IMF, the World Bank, America is going to lead as the number one superpower that is out there. All right. And we're not doing it for love of the world. We're doing it for that, but we're also doing it for love of money, because with peace brings prosperity. So if we are the number one seller of products to the entire world, we want the world to be peaceful so that people can buy our products, not just our military products, but we want them to be able to buy our domestic made manufactured products. Okay? By doing this, we would drive the standard of living up. We would expand democracy and freedom. We would have more allies to trade with and more peace in the world. That is the idea. Now, on the other side of that is going to be the Soviet Union. Their armies occupied most of Eastern Europe. Remember, we were pushing west to east. They were pushing east to west. They bore the number one brunt of this war in terms of death and destruction and money. So they believed that they were owed something, because they could argue that without them, the Germans would have been able to launch all of their military might towards the west to topple Britain and potentially us. So they do have a point there. They helped effectively saw the German military machine in half, which allowed us to come in from one side and them to come in from the other, and ultimately what pushed this war in the favor of the Allies. But they have a lot of territory right now, because as they were pushing east to west, they made those territories now Soviet. So they believed that communism forced a backward nation to become modern. They were prestigious in Europe, and to colonial peoples, the Soviets believed that since they did most of the ground fighting against Germany, that they had the right to have a sphere of influence in Europe. They know that the American economy is bigger, and they know that with Britain, right next to America, that they could be outmanned in any kind of war, whether it be ideological or an actual physical war or an economic sort of tariff war, that they wanted to stick their flag in the ground. Germany had twice invaded Russia in the last 30 years. They were sick and tired of that kind of thing. They had stabilization in their leadership. And they had more than a few admirers, not only in Europe, but also in America, for the kind of society that they were trying to build, which was a worker-centric society. All right, and keep that in the back of your head as we move forward here. Now, our president, FDR is going to die 3 or 4 months into his term in 1845, and then Truman, his vice president, who's his fourth vice president in 4 terms, is going to take over as the new president. He is a Democrat from Missouri. So he will be leading America end of World War II and into the post-World War II world. Now, his doctrine, all right, Winston Churchill is the prime minister of Britain throughout World War II. And he says a lot of famous things in his life. But he's going to make a famous speech in America declaring that an iron curtain had descended across Europe, that new battle lines had already been drawn with the free West versus the communist East, which foreshadowed a long struggle to come. So if there was already a fear that Europe would be torn into war again, here's Churchill in America fanning the flames saying, no, there's direct lines already of us versus them, good versus evil, freedom and capitalism versus communism and socialism. Okay, so March of 47, Truman is going to come out with a strong international policy or interventionist policy that is containment. All right, now think of containment, communism, and cancer as the 3 C's. All right, so if somebody has cancer and they go to the doctor, all right, the first goal for the doctor is to get rid of it completely. But in order for it to be gotten rid of completely, usually a surgery is needed in order to cut it out. All right. Now, if the cancer is either near a vital organ or it has grown to a certain size, they may not be able to cut it out. So the next best maneuver or method is going to be containment, meaning don't let it spread. Keep it where it is. If it spreads, it'll kill you. If we keep it where it is, you'll live longer. We can hope to shrink it and treat it and then eventually be able to cut it out entirely so that you can be cancer free. So cancer, containment, and communism. It's difficult to stop it where it currently is, but do whatever is necessary to stop its spread. And really, this policy is what's going to be the backbone of the Cold War. As the Soviets move from one part of the globe to another, there's going to be the United States chasing after wherever communist influence might spread. Because capitalism and socialism do not see eye to eye. In capitalism, the power belongs to, in a lot of situations, the employer, the bosses, all right? And the workers are part of the equation as well through union protection, which is somewhat of a socialist thing. So there's a balance there going back and forth, but American history has shown that bosses and business leaders and the government that they're tied to typically comes down more on the side of employer freedom. Socialism is all about the worker. So if the power in America lies in the hands of corporations, the power in the Soviet system is going to lie in the government. Now, if you think about this on its head, right? If in our system, even today, the government has the military, the corporations have a lot of the power, and the worker and the voter is somewhere in between those two. Okay, and you could kind of say that that operates as a check and a balance between those different groups. That as long as as long as the government has the military and the corporations have the economic power, they can't kind of cross streams there and one become too powerful with both of those things. And we are the workers, so if we won't work, then the employers are going to have to do something to help us. And if we are voting you out, then the government's going to have to do something to change what we're doing in order for them to be able to stay in power. So whether Americans know it or not, the voter and the worker does have a tremendous amount of power if they can organize and successfully utilize it against the other against the other two. Now, in the Soviet Union, the worker, forget about voters, first of all, okay, because it's a military, it's an autocratic regime. There is no, maybe now they're claimed to be, but back then it was Stalin and that was it. Okay, and if you spoke out against, remember, there's no free press, there's no free speech, so you're not even allowed to leave, all right? You're not allowed to leave the Soviet Union, and we'll talk more about that as we go. So in the Soviet socialist system, you've got the government with all the guns and all the power and controlling all the factories. they have a complete monopoly on power over the worker. So, yes, you'll have a job. Yes, you'll have bread. Yes, you'll have protection, but you'll have no social mobility and you'll have no say over what this government does. Okay? So, Truman is going to make a speech uniting the Democrats and the Republicans in his post war vision of the world where freedom must be defended at all costs around the world so that freedom and democracy can endure. Now, let's add the skeptical part of that: freedom, democracy, and trade can endure. More friends of the West, more friends of democracy and capitalism, more trading partners. More Soviet satellite nations with communism and socialism, less trading partners. So containment, yes, it's an ideological struggle, but it's also a struggle for who rules this new global economy that is growing. Now, the first battle lines in Greece and Turkey, they held a strategic trading importance because Greece and Turkey is sort of like the gateway between Europe and the Middle East and then further into Asia. So if those areas were to fall under Soviet control, that could create a problem with our trade into the Middle East. And remember, what is coming out of the Middle East now and what is going to be increasingly important in the global economy is oil. So if Greece and Turkey were to fall to Soviet influence, that could be an issue. So we are going to spend $400 million, all right, in Greece and Turkey defeating uprising communist groups, because it isn't that the Soviets landed in those countries with military. It's that they would send aid and money to help various communist-leaning groups to try to take over that country. So again, that the nature of this Cold War. Don't send nukes and men and tanks and machine guns. Send aid, send food, send money. Okay? So this calls for the creation of a global partnership to stand against the Soviets, where we then held permanent global responsibility, which we really have never given up until this day. And we're also going to have the creation of the CIA. So the FBI deals with domestic police issues and executive function. CIA is going to be a world police, if you will. Yes, getting involved in espionage and various covert transactions and operations that are going to kind of fly under the radar of military involvement. So it's a way to kind of show this soft power. And that's what the Cold War is. Like we said, spies, food, propaganda, money, weapons, not military men. Okay, not launching wide-scale military operations in countries, because that would just kick up into World War again. And remember, you have to be careful with your military now, because with the Soviets soon to acquire an atomic weapon, what's to stop, a few bullets one way or the other? What's to stop somebody from using one? So we are in like I said, a very, very new world when it comes to, we're kind of dipping our toes into the water of diplomacy rather than the old brute force and men with weapons. So why a Cold War? And I think I covered most of this already. It's an ideological struggle. Both sides claim to be promoting freedom and social justice while defending their own security, and each offers its social system as a model for the rest of the world to follow. So we are out there trying to convert war-torn European countries to join the West, democracy, and capitalism. While the Soviets are saying, hey, capitalism, look what they did with their Great Depression. Come with us. Most people are workers. We will keep bread in your mouths. We will keep heat on in your homes, and we will help you get through your life. Okay? This whole idea of social mobility is a joke because most of them are poor anyway, so it must not be working. Come and work with us. You'll at least have, fairness and a decent wage. All right? So this is an ideological struggle back and forth. And the big thing, it's not so much about the economy, because there are elements of socialism within our economy, but the big thing is going to be the freedom of the individual. The fact that you can do what you want here in America and you can start a business, that's going to be the biggest stark difference to the Soviets. In the Soviet Union, like if your dad worked in that plant or that mill, chances are you were going to work there as well. It didn't matter how good you were at soccer or how good you were with math. All right. There was no college for you. That was what you could expect. So there was a very, very, low ceiling on the heights that someone could rise in the Soviet Union. And that is ultimately going to be why capitalism and democracy is going to defeat Soviet communism. the profit motivation. If somebody wants money here, you can work hard enough to go get it. You can study hard enough. You can develop something. In Soviet Union, none of that creativity, none of that work ethic is really going to be put to use. So you're leaving economic output out there off the table for your country not to be able to get stronger. Now, it's going to take some decades in order to do this, but the Soviet economic system is going to start to suffer pretty soon after this. Okay, so selling this to our American leaders, building upon World War II, thought of dividing the globe into free and enslaved worlds, and the traditional view that America had a mission to spread their ideals of freedom and democracy around the world. Now, let's look at the Marshall Plan. So the Marshall Plan, it's first of all, it's thought to be one of the most successful foreign aid programs in United States history. And again, it's not about military might, it's about money. Europe is completely war-torn. Remember, these countries are decimated from World War II. So they don't have homes to live in. They don't have food to eat. Forget about having a job to go to. You are literally picking up the pieces. Now, desperate people, all right, especially amongst the working class, they are ripe to be taken over by socialist endeavors because it's a worker-centric philosophy. So if most people are workers and most people are not doing well, then just giving somebody a job could simply be enough to say, hey, come with us. Soviet Union, communism, socialism is the way to go. Now, we have to stop the bleeding, all right? So George C. Marshall, who's going to be Truman's Secretary of State, made a speech at Harvard outlining a plan for foreign aid to war-torn Europe. So it's been 2 years since the war ended. Europe is ravaged with food shortages and inflation in the terrible winter of 1946 and 1947. And what is happening is that communist parties in some of our allies, such as France or Britain, is going to start to be strengthened. And we need to stop that before their governments fall to, Soviet-minded people. So they want to combat the growing thought that capitalism was dying and communism was the wave of the future. What are we going to do? Again, soft power, propaganda, money, food, supplies. We pledge billions of dollars in U.S. aid to these war-torn European nations to keep them stable, to increase production, and for freer trade for American business interest and investment. Remember, that's always going to be there. The what's in it for us. We're not just helping these countries out of the good of our hearts. Yes, we don't want them going to communism, but we can't have them going to communism because we need them to trade. We need them to buy our products. All right? We will help them do it through the Marshall Plan. We will restabilize things so that they can buy American-made products. This is George C. Marshall, and this is the amount of money by percentage that went to each of the countries that we are helping through this the early part of this Cold War. So as you can see, United Kingdom is going to get the most, followed by France, 21%, then followed by West Germany, which we'll talk about in another minute, and then Italy, and then the Netherlands, and then we go down from there. So you're seeing some of our new friends, some of our old friends, but you're seeing mostly Western and Southwestern Europe here, not so much Southeastern. We know that the eastern part of like the Balkan Peninsula and Hungary and those areas, they are so heavily controlled by the Soviets already that we're not going to spend money there because they abut, the Ukraine, they abut Russia already, or the Soviet Union. So they're not going to be, there's no point in spending money there. They're already gone. All right, last thing I want to talk about. So where this Iron Curtain meets, right? I mean, how does Germany get broke up among the four powers, all right? And you'll see the map here. So you have the U.S., France, and Great Britain on one side in the south and in the west, and you have East Germany in the right, which is going to be Soviet. So they are going to draw lines through Germany to control, and East Germany and West Germany will be two different countries from this point in time up until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Now, if you look at that little circle, Berlin as a city is in East Germany. But Berlin had strategic importance in the war. That's where all the forces met to collapse in on Germany, since that was the Third Reich was based out of Berlin. So there's a symbolic thing going on here. Not only do you break up Germany into two different countries and then West Germany into territories, giving the Allies each a point, but Berlin itself has to be broken up amongst the four Allied powers. All right? Now, obviously, you've got some yellow, green, and blue, which represents America, France, and Britain, in the middle of a city that's in the middle of a sea of red. All right. So if there's gonna be kind of a spark, all right, it makes sense that that's where it could be. All right. Now, the Berlin blockade. So let's look at this map real quick. All right. This is a map of Berlin. What Stalin is going to do is he doesn't want the Americans, the British, and the French in East Germany. He thinks that Berlin should be completely his. But America, Britain, and France are not going to give it up at all because it's the first little linchpin, if you will, the first little battle, the first little ideological struggle, the first little nibble at aggression between the two different sides. So the Soviets are going to cut off the supply lines, meaning the roads and the railroad, into the American, British, and French parts of the city. Now, technically, the people living in those parts of the city are either going to be taken over by the Soviet Union and incorporated into East Germany, or they're going to remain sort of like a democratic beacon within this communist bloc. All right. So you can see, there's a lot at stake here in this early part of the Cold War in this city and in this East Germany. All right. So the Cold War is going to intensify and take a militaristic turn. And that's what the Cold War is. There are parts of quiet, there are parts of heat, and things are going to heat up towards a maybe military situation, and then things are going to de-escalate. And we're going to see that over and over again. So, 1948, the US, Britain, and France created a new currency to be used in their zones, which was a precursor to the new Western German government. And Stalin doesn't like this Western currency in what he believes to be his city. So he is going to blockade the road and the rail into the western sections of Berlin, leaving the eastern roads open into his side of the city for Soviets. So there's no supplies, there's no food, there's no coal for heat, there's nothing that the people need there in order to survive. So this is a test for America, Britain, and France. What will they do? So if you're going to block the road, they're going to go up over the roads into the airlift, and they're going to begin an 11-month airlift of food and supplies into the western zones of Berlin. And eventually, the Stalin is going to realize that this is an exercise in futility because you're blocking a road, but unless you're going to go up there with military planes and start shooting down our supply planes, we've now shown a willingness that we will supply the West Berliners with things that they need because they are part of our people. All right. So the two new nations are West and East Germany. Germany will not reunify until 1991. We looked at this map. I want to show you this video quickly here.
The Berlin blockade. The droning motors of the candy bombers overhead give hope to West Berliners. Since the 24th of June, 1948, West Berlin has been cut off from the world. The Red Army has been ordered to bar all points of entry into the western sections of the city. Rescue by land is impossible. The Americans and British decide to supply the city with food and vital supplies by way of an airlift. The trapped civilians are counting on the Western allies.
I kept thinking, there's no way they'll allow this to continue. They won't stand for it. They must help us. They will help us.
Countless planes supply the city from the air. 3 secure air corridors have been agreed and are treated as one-way streets. 2 for outbound flights, the middle for return flights. The transporters fly 5 levels above one another, landing in Berlin every 3 minutes.
The first impression was one of constant movement on the runway, aircraft constantly landing and taking off.
We
pulled up and the bags came flying down the ramp. It was really pretty hard work.
Up to 700 flights deliver 5,000 tons daily. September 9th, West Berliners demonstrate for freedom. The mayor, Ernst Reuter, addresses them.
Völker der Welt, ihr Völker in Amerika, in England, in Frankreich, schaut auf diese Stadt und erkennt, dass ihr diese Stadt und dieses Volk nicht preisgeben dürft.
His words are both a call for help and a plea to abide. For the children, the airlift is an adventure.
The aircraft came down very slowly, and you could see the crew, the pilot, and the co-pilot. You could see them all, and they always waved to us.
The Americans have a surprise for the children. Little parachutes.
There was chewing gum and some chocolate attached, and it was always a free-for-all as soon as the candy came down.
This is how America gains the sympathy of the young. Early 1949. Ever larger aircraft bring ever greater quantities of goods. The Soviet Union recognized that its blockade is failing. During negotiations in New York, the Kremlin finally gives in. The passageways into Berlin are opened. May 12th, 1949. Berlin celebrates the end of the blockade. The West has defended its freedom.
We will always remain grateful. They saved us. There's only one thing to say. Hats off. Unbelievable. Great.
Unglaublich. Toll.
The airlift transforms the relations between the victors of World War II and the defeated.
Da ist mir klar geworden, was
It
Freiheit
was then that I understood what freedom means, and also what friendship means. The Western Allies had now become our friends.
Freunde geworden.
All right, guys, so let's end there for today. I'll get this up on Edpuzzle, and I hope you're all doing well, and I'll see you soon. Thank you.